Spring 1941 arrived in the Pindus before the state could steady itself. Snow still clung to the high ridges, but the Greek government had already collapsed under the weight of the German invasion. Outposts that had once flown the national flag stood empty, patrols vanished, and in the deep valleys of Epirus and Thessaly, villagers watched as the map of their world was redrawn overnight, partitioned between German and Italian authorities, whose uniforms suddenly appeared on familiar roads. It was a landscape where the state dissolved faster than the mountains thawed. At first, life did not break. It frayed. Italian units took charge of most of the Pindus zone, but their reach was thin. Detachments settled into garrisons near bridges and towns, attempting to project control across cliffs and goat tracks they barely understood. The distances were vast, the passes unreliable, and Italian morale, damaged by months of fighting and humiliation in Albania, was too fragile to anchor an occupation of such rugged terrain. In the silence between patrols, the authority they claimed was more theoretical than real. Meanwhile, the famine of 1941 crept through the mountains long before it ruined the cities. Harvests were poor, livestock requisitioned, and transport restrictions choked the already limited trade routes that sustained remote hamlets. Many families turned inward, rationing grain, relying on chestnuts, bartering wool for flour. Others looked outward and saw little but uncertainty. Gendarmes replaced by occupiers, tax ledgers abandoned, and the sudden sense that no institution would rescue them from the winter ahead. In this vacuum, distrust grew not just of the Italians, but of any authority that claimed to speak for distant Athens now under German control. It was during this slow-motion collapse that the first armed groups appeared. They were not yet Andartes, in the organized sense the word would later suggest. They were shepherds angry at petitions, deserters unwilling to surrender their rifles, hunters who knew the slopes better than any occupier. They gathered in small knots above Gorgopotamos and the Eos Valley, often with no political banner, simply a shared unwillingness to accept the new order. Their camps were makeshift, their food uncertain, their motives drifting somewhere between survival and defiance. Reports from the time, even from sympathetic witnesses, note that many early actions failed or fizzled before contact was made. Yet in the retellings that would follow, these small, clumsy beginnings would become the origin myths of a wider struggle. Italian commanders, aware of these groups, but unsure of their strength, attempted to pacify them. They sent officers to reassure village elders, promised stability, distributed modest food stocks, and occasionally launched small pursuit columns. But the terrain swallowed their efforts. A patrol might march for hours only to find a single abandoned hut or a set of footprints dissolving into scree. Villagers, whose loyalties rested first with survival, often met Italian inquiries with shrugs and silence. It was not yet resistance, but neither was it cooperation. It was a waiting game, and the mountains favored those who knew their contours. Far beyond the Pindus, in Cairo and London, the British Special Operations Executive examined the situation with caution. SOE operatives, slipping into Greece in the latter half of 1941, found little that resembled the structured resistance movements emerging elsewhere in occupied Europe. They moved from village to village, taking notes in cramped rooms lit by oil lamps, gauging whether these early bands would fight or merely fade when winter hardened. Their reports suggested potential, but not readiness. The Pindus, they wrote, was a land of possibilities, none of them predictable, and yet something was changing. Hunger pushed young men toward the hills, where at least they could forage and move freely. Humiliation, the sense of defeat layered on top of foreign occupation, gave shape to conversations whispered at night. And the mountains themselves offered a kind of protection, an assurance that even without a state, the land could still shield those who knew how to navigate its ridges. By late 1941, informal paths emerged between these embryonic groups. Runners carried news of Italian weaknesses, of abandoned outposts, of small caches of ammunition that could be seized. Some villages discreetly directed food toward the hills. Others turned away recruits, fearing retaliation. Local power brokers, men who once mediated disputes over grazing rights, now found themselves silently weighing decisions that could determine whether their communities would be punished or spared. In the Pindus, politics had not yet arrived, but choices already carried consequences. Still, the early resistance was fragile. Bands argued among themselves, splintered, reformed. Ambushes were attempted with little coordination. A handful of skirmishes produced more confusion than strategic gain. The first winters of occupation were defined less by triumphs than by endurance. And yet, despite the failures, a pattern was forming. Small groups, learning the rhythms of evasion, the uses of terrain, the cracks in Italian patrol routines, skills that would later anchor a full guerrilla war, were being shaped almost accidentally, taught by hunger, fear, and the trials of mountain survival. As 1941 edged into 1942, rumors drifted through the valleys that organized political fronts were emerging elsewhere, that new leaders were gathering followers, that the British might return with supplies. Whether true or not, these whispers shifted expectations. Villagers spoke of a coming storm, unsure whether it would bring liberation or retaliation. The occupiers sensed it too. Italian officers complained of an atmosphere thick with unseen movement lanterns glimpsed on ridgelines, figures vanishing behind stands of fir, mule tracks appearing overnight on slopes they had not patrolled. The Pindus was still quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that suggested preparation, not inactivity. By the time winter loosened its grip on the high passes, the shape of the conflict ahead had begun to reveal itself. The state remained absent, the occupiers uneasy, and the first guerrilla networks, still small, still incoherent, had taken root in the folds of the mountains. No one yet knew what they would become. But the silence of the early occupation had ended. The hills were beginning to echo with new intentions. And as snowmelt carved fresh paths down the ravines, a larger struggle was already gathering strength, one that would soon pull the entire Pindus into a war, unfolding both against the occupiers and within the resistance itself. By early 1942, the mountains no longer hid only scattered bands of fugitives. They sheltered something more deliberate, a resistance beginning to take form, shaped by famine, fear, and a deepening political undercurrent flowing from the lowlands into the high ridges. What emerged that year was not a single movement, but a convergence of necessity and ideology, carried by men who knew the terrain and those who hoped to shape the future waiting beyond the occupation. In the villages along the Aspropotimos and Agrafa corridors, hunger remained the sharpest recruiter. Winter shortages had carved entire households down to essential tasks: tending a few animals, repairing terraces, and protecting dwindling stores of grain. When EAM, the National Liberation Front, extended its political reach into the mountains, it found communities already on the brink. Its promise of organized relief committees, food redistribution, and local councils resonated in valleys where the state had vanished. From these networks emerged ELAS, the Greek People's Liberation Army, which in January 1942 began formalizing the scattered fighters who had survived the previous year's chaos. ELAS's earliest detachments reflected this mix of structure and improvisation. Volunteers arrived with a blend of old Greek army rifles, hunting carbines, and the few captured Italian weapons trickling in from overstretched occupation posts. More important than their equipment was their reorientation. No longer simply mountain men avoiding the authorities, they were now combatants expected to follow orders, adapt tactics, and accept the political guidance offered by EAM cadres. For many, this transition was uneasy, but for others, especially those who had tasted the autonomy of the hills, it offered a sense of direction that famine and defeat had erased. Into this shifting landscape strode Aris Velouchiotis, a figure whose presence would shape the mythology and reality of the Andartes. Charismatic, theatrical, and often intimidating, he imposed discipline through a mixture of ceremony and threat. Witnesses described his appearances as part performance, part mobilization, speeches delivered beneath fir trees, dramatic gestures toward the mountains, devotion of national dignity wrapped in the authority of a man who seemed to know exactly where the struggle should lead. Yet, his methods were not merely symbolic. He insisted on military drills, strict codes of behavior, and punishments that, even in sympathetic accounts. Whatever doubts villagers felt about EAM politics, many agreed on one point: Aris knew how to create order from uncertainty. But ELAS was not the only force emerging from the turmoil. In Epirus, Napoleon Zervas, a seasoned Republican officer, revived EDES, a resistance movement with a very different ideological orientation. Unlike ELAS, which blended nationalism with left-wing mobilization, EDES appealed to anti-monarchists and traditional officers, disillusioned by the collapse of 1941. When the British SOE re-established contact with Greek resistance groups, they saw in Zervas a potential counterweight, someone who could resist Axis occupation without empowering a single dominant faction. And so, in the summer of 1942, British resources, advice, and hopes began to flow into the Epirus Mountains, strengthening EDES's position even as ELAS gained ground farther east. This dual emergence, ELAS ascendant across the Pindus and EDES, cramming in Epirus, reshaped the mountain geography. Paths, once trodden only by shepherds, now carried runners delivering messages between detachments. Cairns and tree markings guided mule caravans transporting ammunition, beans, flour, and blankets. Winter shelters, low stone huts, insulated with wood, became guerrilla staging points. Local councils, encouraged by EAM, organized provisioning, while women's secret networks moved quietly through villages, carrying news and supplies under the guise of daily chores. The countryside, which had once waited fearfully for the occupiers' next move, was beginning to operate according to the needs of its own fighters. With growing organization came the first genuinely coordinated operations. ELAS units, following intelligence collected by villagers and scouts, ambushed small Italian columns on treacherous switchbacks where a single rockfall could trap a convoy. Bridges across minor streams important for local movement were damaged to disrupt Italian patrol patterns. In some valleys, detachments forced garrisons to remain within town limits, unable to navigate the terrain without risking an ambush. These actions did not yet threaten the occupation as a whole, but they changed the rhythm of control. The Italians, who had once patrolled confidently, now travelled with hesitation, their routes dictated not by authority, but by fear of unseen adversaries. The British, observing these developments, adjusted their assessments. SOE officers who had once doubted Greece's readiness for substantial resistance now argued that coordinated sabotage was possible if the movements could, even temporarily, set aside their differences. In Cairo, planners began considering operations that would require the participation of both ELAS and EDES. Yet beneath every hopeful report lay a quiet acknowledgement. These two groups were not natural partners. Their visions for Greece separated sharply, and the mountains, with their isolated communities and overlapping spheres of influence, magnified every rivalry. Yet in early 1942, this fracture was still only a faint outline. Most villagers saw the fighters as their own sons, cousins, and neighbors, regardless of the banner they carried. The enemy, for now, remained the occupiers, but the seeds of internal tension were already visible in whispered warnings about which group controlled which valley, and in EAM's political expectations, which not all recruits welcomed. Still, for the moment, momentum carried the resistance forward. The months of harsh survival had taught the fighters how to move, hide, and strike in terrain that seemed designed for their methods. The occupation forces, though still powerful, had lost the illusion of dominance, and in the ridgelines where ELAS and EDES scouts sometimes glimpsed each other across deep ravines, a silent question hung in the air. Would these movements grow together or collide? By the summer's end, the possibility of a unified blow against the occupiers no longer seemed distant. SOE officers pressed for it. Village councils hoped for it. Even rival commanders, wary though they were, recognized the strategic significance. A single operation, well planned and jointly executed, could demonstrate that the mountains were no longer divided by famine and fear, but aligned by purpose. The ridges were carrying new voices, now messages of coordination, of observation, of something larger developing in the dark. And beneath them, in the forests and gorges of the Pindus, two forces were preparing to test whether unity was truly possible, or merely an illusion shaped by shared necessity. For months, the mountains had echoed with scattered ambushes and cautious probes. But in the autumn of 1942, a different kind of message began to circulate, one that spoke not of small strikes, but of a single, audacious blow. The Allies were struggling in North Africa, and British planners believed that sabotaging a key Axis supply route through Greece might weaken the pressure on the desert front. Their eyes settled on a single target deep in the mountains: the railway bridge at Gorgopotamos. To bring it down would require something unprecedented in the Pindus, a coordinated operation between rivals who barely trusted each other. SOE officers Eddie Myers and CM Woodhouse were inserted into the Greek interior with the expectation, or perhaps the hope, that they could persuade ELAS and EDES to cooperate. Their journey into the mountains revealed a land on edge. Italian patrols were wary, village councils divided their loyalties, and guerrilla detachments quietly assessed these British newcomers whose radios and explosives hinted at possibilities the locals had not dared imagine. It took days of negotiation to bring the two resistance movements into the same room. ELAS arrived with disciplined units under officers shaped by Aris Velouchiotis' strict methods. EDES brought smaller but more professionally trained detachments loyal to Napoleon Zervas. Between them lay a gulf of suspicion. Memories of earlier tensions lingered, and whispers of political ambition trailed every meeting. Yet the target, an imposing steel bridge carrying the vital railway between Thessaly and the south, was too important to ignore. For one night, the question of Greece's future was set aside in favor of the immediate need to strike the occupiers. Planning the operation meant weaving together different strengths. ELAS could move large numbers of fighters swiftly across ridgelines and concentrate them silently near the valley floor. EDES detachments provided experienced demolition men and a tighter command structure. The British brought explosives, timing devices, and a sense of urgency derived from distant battlefields. Survey teams mapped Italian Guard routines, counted patrols, charted approach vectors, and measured the blast requirements. Everything depended on synchronization. Neutralizing the guards, holding back reinforcements, and blowing the supports before the alarm spread. Villagers living near the target sensed the tension even if they did not know the details. Lamps were shuttered early. Livestock was brought indoors. Couriers passed quietly through hamlets, asking for food, blankets, and guides familiar with the riverbanks. For once, the flow of supplies did not favor one faction over another. Both ELAS and EDES needed the community's discretion, and in the silence before the attack, the mountains seemed to absorb the weight of their temporary unity. On the night of 25 November 1942, the assembled force moved toward the bridge. ELAS detachments fanned out to block nearby roads and trails, forming a defensive cordon. EDES fighters, accompanied by SOE experts, crept toward the piers with bundles of explosives. Italian guards, accustomed to routine, noticed nothing unusual in the darkness beyond their lanterns' reach. The river murmured beneath the rails. The mountains loomed above like silent witnesses. When the assault began, it unfolded with a precision rarely seen in the early years of Greek resistance. The guard posts were overwhelmed before they could fire more than a few shots into the night. Explosive charges were placed swiftly. Timed fuses lit with quiet discipline. Fighters waited in the cold shadows as the minutes stretched, each second a reminder that a single misstep could bring Italian reinforcements racing from nearby garrisons. Then the valley erupted. The blast tore through the bridge's supports, sending a shockwave that rolled off the cliffs. Sparks and fragments cascaded into the river gorge, and the middle spans collapsed in a thunderous crash that echoed far beyond the rails. In that moment, every fracture between ELAS and EDES vanished beneath the brilliance of a joint triumph. For the British, it was the most successful sabotage operation yet mounted in occupied Europe. For the resistance fighters, it was proof that unity, however fragile, could achieve the extraordinary. But dawn brought consequences. Italian forces launched reprisals in surrounding villages, searching for collaborators, interrogating elders, and tightening control over local movement. Some communities endured forced evacuations. Others lost livestock and stores to punitive raids. Though the guerrillas escaped into the high ridges, civilians bore the brunt of the occupiers' anger, an outcome that would haunt later debates about the ethics and effectiveness of sabotage in populated areas. Yet, for weeks afterwards, the story of Gorgopotamos spread through the Pindus like a shared heartbeat. Villagers spoke of the explosion with quiet pride. Resistance bands, regardless of alliance, held the night up as a reminder that courage could transcend faction. Even the British, cautious by nature in their reports, hinted at the possibility of further combined operations. And still, beneath the celebration, the fragile threads of cooperation were already fraying. ELAS leaders questioned EDES's ambitions once British supplies increased. EDES officers, wary of ELAS's growing numerical advantage, feared that unity might be a temporary mask. British operatives sensed, with growing unease, that the common purpose forged beneath the bridge might prove unsustainable. For a brief, luminous night, the Greek resistance had moved as one, but as winter settled again over the Pindus, the old ridgelines of distrust re-emerged, sharper than before. The mountains had shown what unity could achieve. Now they would show how difficult it would be to preserve. And as 1943 approached, another voice entered the struggle, not just the occupier tightening its grip, but the shadow of Germany replacing Italy, turning the Pindus into a far deadlier battleground. By the spring of 1943, the brief glow of Gorgopotamos had faded into a harsher reality. The Italian occupation forces, already stretched thin and struggling with morale, were losing their grip on the Pindus. Small garrisons clung to valley towns, patrols avoided narrow passes after dusk, and requisition teams no longer ventured confidently into villages without escorts. The mountains, once merely a challenge to administer, were becoming a battlefield shaped by an increasingly assertive ELAS. Italy's weakening position was not accidental. Throughout early 1943, ELAS detachments expanded rapidly, drawing new recruits from villages battered by famine and emboldened by the success of coordinated sabotage. These units, some numbering 20, others over 100, moved with improved discipline, guided by commanders who had learned the rhythms of guerrilla warfare through a year of trial and error. They built firing positions on ridgelines, dug shelters in dense forests, and established hidden cantonments where fighters could rest, train, and stockpile captured weapons. The Italians, though aware of these developments, struggled to respond effectively. Their supply routes crept through terrain that favored ambushes. Convoys, carrying rations or ammunition, wound along cliffside roads, where a single well-placed boulder or felled tree could trap an entire column. Italian troops, often young conscripts, approached each bend with mounting anxiety. Some units developed informal rules: march quickly, avoid lingering, never speak loudly, and above all, trust no apparent calm in the mountains. As the occupation frayed, ELAS intensified its operations. Scouts mapped enemy routines. Couriers coordinated multi-detachment raids. Ambush teams rehearsed attacks near bridges and mountain spurs. What had begun as scattered resistance was transforming into a semi-regular force whose battlefield instincts matched the mountain's contours. For many villagers, the shift was palpable. Italian authority no longer felt absolute. its boundaries receded, day by day. The turning point came in September 1943, when Italy signed an armistice with the Allies. News travelled rapidly across the Pindus. Italian soldiers, uncertain of their fate, abandoned outposts, fled into the hills, or surrendered weapons to local councils. ELAS units were capitalized immediately. Entire depots of Carcano rifles, machine guns, grenades, and ammunition fell into their hands, arms that would otherwise have taken months of SOE airdrops to supply. Fighters who had once shared a single hunting rifle between 3 men now carried captured weapons in abundance. For the first time, ELAS could contemplate larger, more sustained operations. But the power void created by Italy's collapse did not reward the guerrillas for long. Into this void marched the German 1st Mountain Division, hardened by campaigns in the Balkans. Unlike the Italians, the Germans understood mountain warfare. They traced ambush sites, cut off mule tracks, and studied the patterns of ELAS movements. Their operations followed a distinct rhythm: early morning encirclements, converging sweeps through forests, and rapid retributive strikes against villages suspected of aiding guerrillas. Reprisal policies, though varying in severity, were systematic, designed not only to punish but to deter. The arrival of these forces changed the tone of the conflict. Where Italian patrols had been cautious, German detachments were methodical. They placed outposts on dominating heights, fortified road junctions, and established blocking positions near key passes, such as those around Metsovo and the Ius Valley. Each movement seemed calculated to limit ELAS mobility, to force the guerrillas into costly engagements, and to break the networks that supported them. ELAS responded with adaptability. Bands fragmented into smaller units to avoid encirclement. Fighters hid supplies in multiple caches, anticipating that winter sweeps would target their stores. Women and older villagers maintained silent supply lines, carrying food in baskets, in flour sacks, and beneath cloth bundles disguised as household goods. Children acted as watchers, warning of German patrols with signals learned from grandparents who had used similar systems in earlier conflicts. The mountains, once merely a refuge, had become an integrated network of resistance, yet the human cost mounted. German anti-guerrilla operations displaced entire communities. Some villages evacuated preemptively, retreating to high pastures or remote huts for safety. Others endured house burnings, confiscations, or forced gatherings in central squares. ELAS commanders urged civilians to endure, arguing that the struggle demanded sacrifices. But villagers often faced choices with no good outcome. They could not control who passed through their hamlet, nor could they easily refuse requests from armed guerrillas who represented their own neighbors and kin. Despite these pressures, ELAS grew in strength. With new weapons from Italian stockpiles and fresh recruits driven by anger at German reprisals, its detachments swelled into battalion-sized groups. Some operated with a degree of structure resembling a regular army, complete with political officers, medical teams, and training regimens. Others retained a looser, more fluid character, guided by local commanders who adapted ELAS directives to village realities. The Germans countered with winter operations aimed at cutting off guerrilla mobility. Snowbound passes became traps, and fighters learned to navigate with extreme caution. In some campaigns, German units attempted to encircle entire mountain masses, pushing ELAS detachments toward pre-designated kill zones. While these operations rarely destroyed the guerrillas completely, they inflicted heavy strain and forced ELAS to abandon some strongholds temporarily. But beneath the clash between ELAS and the Axis, something else was forming, an internal dividing line that would soon prove as dangerous as any enemy patrol. As ELAS gained strength, its relationship with EDES grew increasingly tense. Each sought to defend its territory, expand influence, and secure British support. Even as German pressure intensified, rival factions eyed each other across political and geographic boundaries. By late 1943, the Pindus Mountains were no longer defined simply by occupation. They were shaped by two parallel wars, one against the German forces, tightening their grip, and another, still mostly unspoken, between resistance movements, preparing for a struggle that would determine Greece's post-liberation future. And as winter settled over the ridgelines, the question was no longer whether ELAS could withstand German operations, but whether the resistance itself could survive the growing fracture within. By early 1943, the mountains no longer echoed with a single war. Beneath the clash of ambush and reprisal, another conflict, quieter but steadily rising, began shaping the fate of the Pindus. What had once been an uneasy coexistence between ELAS and EDES now hardened into rivalry. Their visions for Greece diverged, their zones of influence overlapped, and their relationship with the British grew more complicated with each passing month. The mountains that had sheltered the resistance were becoming a fault line. In Epirus, EDES expanded cautiously. Zervas, pragmatic and seasoned, consolidated his hold on strategic towns and valleys west of the main Pindus range, especially around Arta and Ioannina. His forces benefited from British airdrops, rifles, machine guns, clothing, and radios. Yet, this support came with pressure. SOE officers expected EDES to strike consistently at the Germans, but also to coexist with ELAS. Neither expectation proved easy. German operations limited EDS's freedom of movement, while ELAS's eastward and northward expansion pressed against EDES's emerging boundaries. ELAS, meanwhile, surged across Thessaly and into western Macedonia. It was larger, more decentralized, and more deeply embedded in village councils and supply networks. Its commanders, many shaped by Aris Velouchiotis's rigid style, saw political mobilization as inseparable from military action. Where ELAS established a foothold, it often encouraged the formation of EAM committees, educational gatherings, and local tribunals. For supporters, this was a path toward popular empowerment. For critics, it was an attempt to dominate post-war Greece before liberation had even arrived. The two forces might still have coexisted, had the mountains been infinite. But the Pindus is a narrow world. Valleys converge, villages sit within a day's march of one another, and trails intersect on high passes where two patrols can meet by chance. In such a landscape, spheres of influence collide easily, and misunderstandings become provocations. By mid-1943, skirmishes between ELAS and EDES detachments once isolated became more frequent. A patrol detained here, a weapons cache seized there, a village ordered to pledge support to one faction rather than the other. Each incident generated accusations, which travelled quickly up the chain of command to leaders already wary of each other's motives. SOE officers, moving between camps with radios slung across their backs, tried to mediate. They arranged meetings, pressed commanders for restraint, and warned London that the divide threatened the broader war effort. Their influence, however, had limits. They could offer supplies, but they could not dictate allegiance. The British attempted to formalize unity in political agreements. The Lebanon Conference of 1943 and the Caserta Agreement of 1944 aimed to unify resistance movements under a notional national command. Delegates signed documents, shook hands, and posed for photographs meant to symbolize coherence. But the agreements, made far from the mountains, struggled to bind fighters who lived by the realities of local terrain and local rivalries. In some valleys, restraint held; in others, distrust hardened faster than paper could mend it. Villagers found themselves caught between the widening fracture. Some communities supported EDES, drawn by older Republican loyalties or a desire for a force perceived as more moderate. Others aligned with ELAS, impressed by its organization and sweeping promises of social reform. Many simply wanted protection, food security, safety from German reprisals, and relief from forced requisitioning. But with two competing guerrilla authorities, neutrality became nearly impossible. A village feeding one faction risked punishment from the other. A hamlet sheltering EDES scouts might face ELAS demands the following week. Amid this tension, British officers faced their own dilemma. Their initial strategy to support multiple factions to prevent any single group from dominating began to unravel. Reports to Cairo revealed growing anxiety. Some officers argued that sustained support for EDES would maintain balance. Others urged backing ELAS, whose numbers and reach made it the more formidable anti-Axis force. London's decisions sometimes shifted with the needs of broader Allied strategy, leaving both resistance movements suspicious of British intentions. On the ground, ELAS pressed its advantage. Its commanders viewed ED's positions around Arta and the Ionian foothills as obstacles to political and territorial cohesion. In 1943 through 1944, a series of ELAS operations pushed against EDES strongholds, isolating detachments and disrupting supply lines. EDES fighters, fewer in number and lacking the deep village networks ELAS enjoyed, struggled to hold ground, relying increasingly on British airdrops to sustain their operations. To many villagers, the conflict between the two Greek groups felt like a betrayal of the unity glimpsed at Gorgopotamos. They understood the political differences vaguely, but they saw clearly the mounting insecurity, families displaced, not just by German sweeps, but by the need to avoid becoming collateral in guerrilla disputes. Elders who once mediated between shepherd clans now mediated between armed detachments demanding grain or recruits. Even as German pressure persisted in parts of the mountains, the resistance's internal war overshadowed the occupation. It was a contest shaped not only by ideology but by logistics. Control of roads, access to food, recruitment pools, and the loyalty of key passes. The mountains had become a map of competing futures. By early 1944, the fracture was unmistakable. ELAS held the stronger position, but EDES survived with British support and local determination. The Germans were withdrawing from some regions to reinforce other fronts. Yet the guerrillas, ostensibly fighting the same occupier, spent precious energy maneuvering against each other. What began as defensive posturing had become open contestation, and as the German grip on the Balkans weakened, a profound question hung over every ridge. When liberation arrived, who would hold authority in the vacuum left behind? The answer would shape not just the mountains, but all of Greece. And the tensions simmering across the Pindus suggested that liberation would not bring resolution but a new, sharper uncertainty. By mid-1944, the occupation no longer pressed evenly across the Pindus. The German war effort was collapsing elsewhere, and its forces in Greece, stretched thin, short on fuel, and increasingly isolated, began preparing for a strategic withdrawal through the Balkans. For villagers in the highland valleys, this shift did not feel like liberation. It felt like the beginning of an unpredictable transition, a moment when authority in the mountains loosened without any clear sense of what would replace it. German patrols, once frequent and aggressive, became erratic. Some garrisons reduced their control radius. Others fortified positions along roads essential to their retreat. Checkpoints that had once dominated river crossings were dismantled overnight, only to reappear in another valley a day later. Soldiers spoke openly in the markets where they still dared to appear about reorganizing for departure. Yet, even in retreat, the German 1st Mountain Division remained dangerous. Its commanders knew that any sign of weakness might invite attacks from ELAS or EDES, and they adopted a pattern of sudden, violent raids to discourage pursuit. Into this shifting landscape moved ELAS with newfound confidence. As German posts were contracted, ELAS units moved into the vacated territory, establishing councils, courts, and rudimentary police forces. In many villages, governance returned, not through the reappearance of pre-war institutions, but through structures created during the resistance. Administrative committees, supply commissions, conflict resolution bodies. Roads were repaired by local work brigades, grain stores inventoried, and ration systems reinstated. To supporters, this was a moment of empowerment, proof that the resistance could govern as well as fight. To doubters, it signaled the emergence of a parallel authority with ambitions reaching far beyond the mountains. These changes altered daily life. Taxes were not reinstated, but contributions to the guerrilla cause continued in the form of food, clothing, and sometimes labor. Young men who had once hidden from German sweeps now volunteered for ELAS patrols. Schools reopened under local initiative. In some valleys, even small cultural events, music gatherings, communal meals briefly returned, tentative reminders of normality after years of occupation. Yet beneath the relief lay an unease. The occupier was leaving, but the future remained unsettled. EDES, though smaller and geographically concentrated in Epirus, also sensed opportunity. Xerxes sought to consolidate his support around the Ionian hinterland, bolstered by British supplies that arrived more frequently as Allied strategy shifted toward stabilizing post-liberation Greece. EDES detachments moved to secure key passes and towns that could anchor their influence after German withdrawal. Their operations were more cautious than ELAS's, focused on reinforcing defensible positions rather than expanding deep into contested areas. But they were no less strategic. British officers, operating across both factions, found themselves navigating a political terrain as complex as the mountain paths. Their instructions had evolved. Sabotage was no longer the priority. Post-occupation stability was. This meant encouraging both groups to prepare for demobilization, urging cooperation that neither side genuinely wanted, and moderating disputes that erupted with increasing frequency. Reports sent to Cairo were not filled with operational details but with concerns that the end of German occupation might trigger internal conflict on a scale unseen since the early days of resistance. Alongside these developments, a subtle but significant shift occurred in liberated zones. For the first time, civilians began openly expressing their anxieties about what might come next. Would the guerrillas stay indefinitely? Who would enforce order once the last German convoy vanished into the north? Which laws would apply, the pre-war codes or the new regulations crafted by local resistance councils? The questions multiplied as rumors spread that the government in exile was preparing to return, that British troops might land in Athens, that political factions in Cairo were negotiating Greece's future without input from the fighters who had held the mountains for years. As summer deepened, German activity contracted sharply. Months earlier, the sound of boots on forest paths or trucks grinding through passes had signaled danger. Now the mountains grew quiet again, their silence broken only by the rumble of distant demolitions, as retreating units destroyed bridges and depots they could no longer defend. ELAS patrols found roadblocks abandoned, trenches empty, supply sheds stripped bare. The occupiers' presence, once an everyday reality, was fading into the shadows of the valleys. With every kilometre the Germans surrendered, the stakes between ELAS and EDES rose. Both groups understood that the true contest was no longer tactical control over a ridge or village, but political authority over the liberated nation. The British, attempting to shape a unified framework, convened discussions that stressed cooperation and national unity. Yet even as words of agreement were signed, neither faction relinquished its strategic ambitions. In the cafes of small towns now under resistance control, conversations shifted toward politics. Who would govern? What justice would look like? How returning officials from exile would interact with those who had endured the occupation? For many fighters, the struggle against the Axis had been only half the story. The other half was unfolding now, quietly but unmistakably, as liberated zones experimented with forms of administration that might or might not survive the approaching transition. By October 1944, the last German troops withdrew from most of mainland Greece. Their departure left behind a vacuum, one shaped by 4 years of hardship, courage, and division. Villagers climbed to high lookouts to watch dust clouds trailing the final convoys. Guerrilla units advanced cautiously, half expecting traps, half anticipating celebration. And yet, instead of triumph, what many felt was apprehension. Liberation had arrived, but clarity had not. ELAS governed vast swathes of the countryside. EDES held its strongholds. British influence hovered above both, and the distant government in exile prepared to return to a homeland it had not seen since 1941, and in the mountains where the resistance had been born, the wind carried a quiet question, one that neither victory nor retreat could answer. What kind of peace would follow a war fought by more than one vision of the future? By late 1944, the mountains that had once echoed with the clash of resistance and occupation stood strangely still. German forces were gone, their posts abandoned, their passes silent. Yet for the people of the Pindus, liberation did not feel like an ending. It felt like a threshold, one that opened onto a landscape shaped not by foreign rule, but by unresolved rivalries within the resistance itself. The war had lifted, but the arguments remained, hanging in the valleys like a mist that refused to rise. In many villages, ELAS patrols continued their routines as if little had changed. They managed checkpoints, mediated disputes, inspected storehouses, and operated local councils formed during the occupation. Fighters who had spent years moving through forests and ravines now walked openly along village roads, greeted by some with gratitude, by others with quiet apprehension. Their presence signaled stability, yet also a lingering uncertainty. Would they step aside now that the occupier had left, or would their wartime authority harden into something more permanent? Attempts at demobilization began almost immediately. Under emerging Varkiza-style expectations, still informal in late 1944, guerrillas were encouraged to disarm, return home, and allow national authorities to resume control. But in the mountains, where governance had been improvised through necessity and sacrifice, few accepted these instructions at face value. Many ELAS units viewed disarmament as premature, doubting whether the government in exile or the British understood the conditions under which they had fought. Others feared that laying down weapons would leave their communities vulnerable to retribution, political marginalization, or the return of pre-war structures they believed had failed to protect them. EDES encountered the same dilemma from another direction. Xerxes' fighters, concentrated in Epirus, knew that British expectations would shape their post-liberation fate. They were urged to maintain order without provoking clashes and to cooperate with administrative transitions. But as EDES detachments tightened their positions around Arta and other foothills, they faced the reality that ELAS controlled far larger regions and that coexistence in the emerging political framework would require delicate negotiation. The mistrust nurtured over 2 years of rivalry did not dissipate simply because the occupiers had fled. For civilians, the end of the occupation brought relief, but also new pressures. Rebuilding began in fragments. Families returned to homes damaged by German reprisals or guerrilla skirmishes, patching roofs with pine planks and salvaged tiles. Terraces had to be cleared of debris before they could be planted. Fields left fallow during sweeps needed tending before spring. Yet agricultural recovery required cooperation, and cooperation was difficult when the presence of armed men, ELAS in one valley, EDES in another, meant that loyalties could still be scrutinized. Many returning fighters also faced a quieter, more personal conflict. Years spent in the mountains had reshaped them. Their identities were tied not only to the war against the occupiers, but to the systems of solidarity built through hardship, hunger, and shared danger. Returning to everyday life, ploughing fields, repairing homes, rejoining families, required an adjustment that many had not anticipated. The mountains had taught them urgency and vigilance. Peace demanded patience and trust, neither of which came easily. British forces, arriving in liberated areas and preparing for operations in Athens, attempted to mediate. Their priority was national stability, not the internal dynamics of mountain resistance. They encouraged cooperation, discouraged unilateral control, and pressed both ELAS and EDES to accept a unified administrative structure. But the gulf between policy and local reality was wide. Reports described regions where ELAS courts continued to operate, villages where EDES influence shaped decisions, and numerous communities where neither faction had fully relinquished wartime roles. In some towns, political committees formed spontaneously, attempting to bridge the divide. Teachers, priests, and elders met to discuss how schools should reopen, how to manage rationing, and how to organize reconstruction brigades. These efforts reflected a genuine desire to move beyond wartime divisions. Yet the shadow of factional identity lingered. A schoolteacher associated with ELAS might not be welcomed in an EDES-aligned village. A returning farmer seen as sympathetic to EDES might be viewed with suspicion in an ELAS stronghold. The deeper problem was legitimacy. For 4 years, the mountains had been governed by necessity, not by national institutions. The reintroduction of pre-war administrative structures required more than written decrees, it required acceptance. And acceptance was precisely what neither faction could fully grant the other. The result was a landscape in which authority flickered, shifting from one valley to the next, shaped not by laws but by memory, loyalty, and fear of what unresolved tensions might become. By winter's arrival in late 1944, the political atmosphere grew heavier. Greece was free of its occupiers, yet captive to its divisions. As news reached the Pindus of clashes erupting in Athens, the Decembriana crisis villagers sensed that the mountains were no longer isolated from national turmoil. The debates in distant cities mirrored the arguments already simmering at home. Who would govern? Who had earned the right to shape the new Greece? And what would become of those who resisted, not only the Axis, but each other? The fighters who gathered around village hearths that winter could not escape the feeling that something unfinished remained. The mountains had forged them, sheltered them, and witnessed their victories. But they had also absorbed the bitterness of rivalry, the weight of factional ambition, and the consequences of choices made under the pressure of survival. And as snow settled across the high passes, softening paths worn by years of struggle, the Pindus whispered of a future not yet resolved. Victory had come, but unity had not. What lay ahead was not a continuation of war, but a contest over peace itself, a contest seeded in the very ridgelines where resistance had once been born. History echoes loudest in the places where unity faltered and choices narrowed. Stay with the channel as we continue uncovering the hidden aftermaths of World War II's most overlooked fronts. Like, share, and subscribe to bring more untold stories into the light.